Good morning, everyone. Sorry about that little minor technical snafu there. External screens and all that fun. So I'm going to be talking today about my career and how it has sort of accidentally revolved around open source and how that could be a thing that you might want to think about with your own career. My name is Clinton Roy. You might know me from such conferences as PyCon AU 2015 and 2014 here in Brisbane. You might also know me from this year's Python conference where I was stapled to the registration desk. I was trained as a software engineer here at the University of Queensland, and on my business cards I call myself an open source engineer because practically all of the knowledge that I have is based upon working with open source tools and languages. Sorry. I can see the screen now. I'm happy. So my open source career. So it started off being a CS tutor here at UQ. I then worked for a research group called DSTC, which was also based here at UQ. Something that I very quickly learned is that most federally funded research groups spend practically all of their money on staff and practically all their money on staff, a little bit on hardware and almost nothing on software. So that means that you end up using open source software because that's the only choice you've got. I then moved on to Aqua, which was a physics research group based here at UQ, and they worked on a physical state of matter called a Bose-Einstein condensate. It's a very cool state of matter. If you cool a bunch of baryon atoms down to very close to absolute zero, the atoms lose their individuality and form a lump of matter. If you shine light down that, the light slows down to about 16 metres a second, so that's sort of cycling speed. And you can also use that to get very easy entanglement stuff happening. And you can also do chemical reactions on that. And if you put enough baryon electrons into that BEC state, you can have an atom that's large enough that you can actually look at it through a microscope, and you can do chemical reactions on it and actually see the chemical reactions happening. Next I worked for CSIRO out at Pullenvale. They have a robotics lab out there. All of the stuff that they have done is open source. One of the things that I was brought on to do was to clean up a lot of their source so that they could release it as open source. So there was probably my first job where I was actually hunted down specifically for my skill sets with open source. Then I was back here at the e-research group. The e-research group is a group of IT professionals providing their IT expertise to people, to researchers who need some help in that field. Then I took my first commercial job, which was for a Brisbane-based company called Netbox Blue. Netbox Blue does network interception stuff. So things like if you've got a school and it's set up with one of the netboxes, you can let all of the kids go and use Facebook, but if they attempt to post an image to Facebook, we just block that particular image being uploaded. And it's a full toolkit for that sort of stuff, so you can let people post to Twitter, for example, but you can stop them swearing, for example. Just before Christmas, we were bought out by Bloomberg, so I'm now doing pretty much the same stuff as I was for Netbox, but now for an international financial company. So I've basically gone from filtering kids' filthy mouths to filtering bankers' filthy mouths. So I didn't want to get into the details of those jobs except to show that they were in widely different areas. Like we went all the way from mining trucks to esoteric states of physical matter. At eResearch I was working on Great Barrier Reef, climate change. So my career has really spanned the whole gamut of what you can do with IT. Really the only connection there is that the vast majority of the stuff that I was working on was open source. Very early on in the piece, I realised that if you are using a bit of open source technology and you have applied a patch locally to make it do something, push that patch upstream. Do not carry your patches locally because that just makes more work for yourself. And that was one of my really early sort of learnings in this field. So I just want to quickly go over some of the skills that have been transferable through these jobs, and you can sort of see that although the areas that I work in are wildly different, the core skills that I've got are pretty much the same, and I get to apply those across a lot of jobs. One of the things that I really like about open source is that if you fix the bug and push it upstream, it's fixed for good. In a lot of places, if you're using a big piece of proprietary software, you pay money to the company, you get to put a bug report in, and then 2 or 3 jobs later, you work at another company that's using the same big piece of proprietary software, and you get to file the same bug report again. And it's like, oh look, that bug report I put in 6 years ago still hasn't been fixed. So most of my core knowledge starts from operating system level stuff. So I'm a Unix guy, I'm a Linux guy, and just about everything else sort of falls out from that. I can kind of vaguely stumble around on a Mac box, on a Windows box, or any box that's like predominantly mousey versus predominantly keyboard. I'm hopeless. And you know, this means that I don't do much user interface stuff. I don't do much with colours. I don't do much with shapes. And I'm still trying to work out if that's something that I'm not good at or everyone else is terrible at and I just don't want to go near their crap. I still haven't quite worked that out. So predominantly my job is programming in some way or form. So the languages that I tend to use again and again is C and Python. There's definitely been a smattering of C++. I've had a couple of jobs with Java. If I have the opportunity or the choice, I don't use Java, but it's still a skill I have. The openness of that language is a different sort of open to other languages, so there's definitely some conversations to be had about that. I think Java's a really interesting point where you can look at the community around Java, and there was a really strong engineering community, and they kept backwards compatibility as one of their key principles for the language. And you can sort of see how that hamstrung the user community that actually wanted to propel Java forward and add new features and add new language constructs. So there's definitely a tension there in the different styles of community that you're interested in. So skills that I've got, I'm good with parsing stuff. So I've written all sorts of different parsers for different languages, different domain-specific languages that the different groups I've worked with have had. I'm pretty good at troubleshooting, and you know, this is all the way from like the autonomous mining truck just ran into the wall, what went wrong, all the way down to this stupidly large database that I told you would fail has failed. Could you please fix it? And some of the funnest stuff that I've done is dealing with hardware and electronics. There's a simpleness with software that's really nice that you can get to play with in your mind, but there's nothing like validating your mistakes by having to make that stuff work in hardware. I do a lot of infrastructure stuff. I'm very keen on being able to do reproducible builds on things. A lot of the time in a lot of companies there'll be what's sort of come to be known as like the snowflake server, where over a course of a couple of years or more, the service that this organisation has built, it works fine. but if that machine or that hard drive crashed, they're hosed and they won't ever actually be able to get it up and running again. So a lot of the time the stuff that I'm doing is based around getting the software compilable, packaged, installable, and making that easy to do. So I do the auto tools, AutoConf, configure, automake, libtool, all of that stuff. I practically do that in my sleep, which means that I don't sleep particularly well. And I do a lot of packaging work in my different roles, so not just binary blobs or source blobs, but actually installable packages via Debian package files or Red Hat package files. I do a lot of low-level stuff. So I do kernel hacking, I do networking, I do installation, I do backups, as well as the actual programming stuff. So that's sort of the nitty-gritty stuff out of the way. And now I want to talk about the community stuff, which is very hard for me to put into words. I'm not terribly introspective. So a lot of these concepts take a long time for me to realise that they're actually a thing. So when you're preparing a talk like that and you're approaching a topic that you can kind of feel but not really discuss, I think that's a really useful thing to sort of force yourself to do something that's a little bit outside of your domain of expertise. So for me, communities are a collection of people that are working towards the same goal. Sometimes that goal is solving a problem. Sometimes that goal is just to have a nice social group. Sometimes, like in an open source world, that means that they're trying to solve a technical problem. But I think it's important to realise that there are many communities that they've got to a certain steady state and they just want to keep that steady state going, and there's no problem with that. In a lot of the open source communities, certainly the older ones that I'm involved with, mailing lists are the key sort of communication medium that the communities use to talk to each other. But I think it's really important to point out that I'm not sure if it's really an 80-20 rule for this, but there is an enormous number of people inside communities, like the Debian community, for example, that don't post to the mailing list anywhere near as often as other people. You'll have a small subset of people which communicate often all of their great thoughts to the rest of the community. And if you look, as an outsider, if you look at their mailing lists, you might think that set of people who are sending all those mails is the community. But in a lot of cases, there's a much greater set of people outside of that mailing list that are also the community. So certainly, when I was growing up, Mail and IRC were the go-to tools for communicating. Today, it's much more Slack and Trello and GitHub. And you know, it doesn't really matter what tool you're using as long as everyone's sort of polite, which is something that, you know, we're still struggling with. I'll get onto this in a little bit, but there's definitely the communities that I'm involved with. The face-to-face thing is something that's really important to all of the communities that I'm involved with. So, you know, for 90% of the year, you might just be speaking to people online, but we hold conferences yearly, every 2 years or something like that, where we get together. And I cannot understate how important that sort of face-to-face meeting is in keeping a community cohesive. So, where did this all start for me? It started here at UQ. Probably about 20 years before I joined UQ itself, the internet was linked up to UQ. And to get access to the computing infrastructure that had the internet link, you had to pay a little bit of money. and a group of students got together to pool their money so that they could buy more computer time and internet time. And that group formed itself into what we know as Humbug today. And Humbug is basically the Brisbane's Unix group. And in my second or third year of uni, I joined Humbug. And that's sort of basically where I got my introduction to Linux and was given, they're called CD-ROMs, folks. You used to get optical discs, and I used those to install Linux on my machines, and that was my introduction to a lot of this stuff. So like prior to that, I didn't really have my own computer, so I was using the lab computers here at uni. All of those were Unix-based, but that was that was definitely Unix, so it's very different to Linux. And one of the tool sets that came installed with Linux was Python. And I think it was like Python 1.3 or something at the time when I was first mucking around with it. And one of our lecturers had this crazy plan where you could submit your assignment answers in any language that you liked. And I, of course, chose a language that I didn't know, which was Python. And it was an algorithms and data structure class, so we had to submit our programs, and we also had to prove that the programs were running in the quickest possible way because we'd implemented the algorithms correctly. So we had to show that the big O notation on running time was correct. And I ended up having to prove to the lecturer that if Python was implemented correctly, it would have run at the right speed. My code was fine, it was all the Python's code that was incorrect. And one of our leading lights in Humbug, Raymond Smith, got a little bit grumpy that the Sydney folks had held a Linux conference down in Sydney. And he wanted to bring it up to Brisbane. And there was a little bit of sort of political fussing going along. It's like, you know, no one's going to go to Brisbane for a technical conference. But Raymond persisted. Now, at the time, I was with Humbug, and I was also working with Raymond at the STC. So I got to see him go through all of this work to get this conference organised here. So he had to organise the venues here at UQ. He had to go cap in hand to sponsors. He had to do more paperwork to get visas for speakers than I've ever seen anyone do. So it's like, we need his passport. You invite a speaker in, and it's like, oh, we need his passport. And it's like, just a photocopy is fine. And you take a photo of the person's picture face in the passport, and they're like, yeah, that's great. Now, can you show us the other pages? And it's like, oh, and you go through and show all the travel stamps. It's like, no, I'm sorry. So you need to send us a fax of every page of his visa, back, front, if it's empty or not. And of course, Raymond has invited something like a dozen overseas speakers. So he's had to do all of this for all of the speakers. And he's pretty much run this entire conference himself. I was helping out a little bit, but like a really tiny bit. But that was my first exposure to attending a conference and helping to organise a conference. And that really, really sort of lit a flame within me for seeing some of these people that, prior to that, I'd seen their names on mailing lists, I'd seen weblog posts about some new thing, I'd seen their names in like change logs in the kernel, and here, sitting in front of me, and like I was literally like the water boy for this conference, because it was a nice January in Brisbane. We'd had a public transport strike, and I was running around getting bottles of water to everyone, and I just about killed myself from heat exhaustion. But there in front of me were these people that, prior to that point in time, I'd only read about. So since then, I've really embraced the power of conferences and sort of got suckered into helping run a few more. And I sort of feel that the open source community, through their technical prowess have given me this suite of tools that I've been able to use job after job after job. And I sort of feel that it's my responsibility to give back to that community, as well as the technical feedback. I ended up spending a lot of time organising conferences. And this runs the whole gamut, so I'm speaking at conferences, I'm volunteering for conferences. You might have seen me last year, I did like 25,000 steps on the first day of CompCon last year, just running around getting snags and things like that. So I've run PyCon Australia in Brisbane for the last 2 years, and I helped out down in Melbourne this year. I won't be helping out next year, I hope. I've also helped out with Kiwi PyCon a little bit. LinuxConf AU, we've had that in Brisbane twice now, and sorry, 3 times now, and I've gradually stepped up my roles in that, and I've done a lot of work for that. OSDC we've held in Brisbane, KCA, that's the Kernel Conf AU, and there are other conferences in the open source world that I help out with, like WordPress. I don't use WordPress at all. My only real link to it is that the parent organisation, Linux Australia, that runs those events, also runs the other conferences, so I just put my hand up and help out. I also give back in time by organising things. So I've been on the Linux Australia Council, and they help govern some of these events. So Linux Australia is the financial backer for PyCon AU and LinuxConf AU and WordPress and a bunch of other conferences. Library Hack. I sort of grew up in libraries, so to see libraries these days embrace open source as a philosophy is really nice for me, and it's meant that I've been able to give back when they were open sourcing some of their data sets. And Library Hack has sort of been overtaken by GovHack now, and I've been able to help out with GovHack as well. Locally, and obviously because Humbug started this story for me, or journey, I suppose I should say, I also give back to Humbug. So I'm always giving talks at Humbug. I'm always trying to organise other speakers to come in and give talks. I've been on the executive for Humbug like half a dozen times, if not more. I'm currently in the second year of being secretary. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I've started producing a podcast series. There's a podcast called Hacker Public Radio, and it's a community-driven podcast. So it's not the same speakers from episode to episode. Anyone in the community can produce a podcast and upload it, and they want it to be a topic that's interesting to hackers in the good sense, not the bad sense. And so I'm sort of planning to do maybe an episode a month next year. I've been spending a lot of time in the last couple of years helping out with Coder Dojo at the Brisbane City Council libraries. Coder Dojo is a worldwide movement to help train kids and get kids exposed to learning to program. And the Brisbane City Council has really done an outstanding job of supporting this. So basically for 6 weekends we go to a library and we have a bunch of kids that come in and we help them code, we help them design 3D models for 3D printing, anything that is IT based and technically focused, we help them out with. And I've done a little bit of planning for working with Engineers Without Borders. They have some projects that require software stuff, and I hope to be doing some more stuff with them in future. And also there's the technical side of things where I'm really good at answering technical questions. And there are groups like Software and Data Carpentry, which are kind of like the e-research group that I was working with. Software and Data Carpentry are coming up with lessons and a teaching philosophy to help train up researchers who are using IT. And so these could be like biology researchers who are all about genetics, all about a particular plant species. It's really, really hard these days to do any sort of research without using computer skills. So Software and Data Carpentry is all about teaching basic computing skills to researchers. And I am a certified teacher for software carpentry, and I have taken a few days leave to go down to some of the universities down the Gold Coast and teach some of these lessons. So we're teaching them basic source code repository stuff with Git, we're teaching them basic shell and basic Python, but there's a whole heap of classes that are available there. And because most of the places that I've worked at have been research institutes, I sort of feel like I'm giving back to the research institutes as well. There are the weekend hack events, so like GovHack, HealthHack. HealthHack is coming up in Brisbane soon, actually. Library Hack and the Indigenous Startup Weekends that was only a few weeks ago, where I pretty much provide technical services. So I just make myself known. If anyone's got any technical questions, come and ask the guy who's nearly falling asleep at the front desk. And that's been really, really useful because you can really quickly help people make a decision between two difficult things. And often for the startup weekends, the whole goal of a lot of these is to get something in front of the judges. And from a technical perspective, you sort of end up going to more smoke and mirrors stuff rather than a final solution in a product that you could roll out. But it's still a very useful service that you're providing. And when you become the organiser of organisations like Linux Australia, which has a grants scheme, and for groups like Humbug and other conferences, you can actually start to give back financial help to the communities that helped you get where you were. So the conferences that we run as Linux Australia, we make sure that they have a strong student outreach. We try to make sure that they all have tickets that are relatively cheap for students, and we also make it so that if people volunteer for the conferences, it will be even cheaper or even free. And some of the things that we've been able to do through Humbug here is we've been able to give students free tickets to Linux Conf AU and PyCon AU if their lecturer has thought that they were worthy of attending those conferences. So the communities that I sort of feel involved with in the open source world is the Python community. I've always felt that they've been rather gentlemanly. I'm trying to find a more gender-neutral term for that. And then we've got the Debian community, which I've never thought of as gentlemanly, but it is improving. So Debian, for those who might not know, it's a Linux distribution, and it's one of the few distributions that's still going strong that is an all-volunteer distribution. It's not backed by a particular company. And one that I've sort of recently got involved with a fair bit is systemd, which is the new process monitor for Linux. That's a really interesting community to be involved with. They've had a lot of shade thrown their way, particularly in the last couple of days. But I really like what they're trying to do and where they're trying to go. As I've previously mentioned, I've grown up in libraries. They've sort of been my safe space, for want of a better term. So I'm very happy to be able to give back to the Brisbane City Council libraries and the State Library at Southbank. The particular component at the State Library is the Edge, They used to call themselves a digital cultural centre. They're all about technology, teaching and learning, and helping people gain modern skill sets. And of course, conferences. So I've been to all of the PyCon Australia conferences and nearly all of the Linux Conf AUs. So the next Linux Conf AU is down in Hobart, and I think that will be my 16th. And Linux Conf AU is really special to me because there's a whole bunch of people that I only get to meet who travel internationally for this conference, and I only get to meet them at that conference every year. So we have a catch-up dinner once a year, every year at that conference. And yeah, it kind of blows my mind that I've been going to the same conference for like 16 years in a row, but you know, it's kind of cool as well. So when you're talking about giving back to an open source community, you have to talk about licensing. I don't want to talk about licensing, but you have to. The work that you do on work time is probably theirs. The work that you do on your own time is probably yours. You have to pick a license that you're happy with. And there's a number of questions around that. And it basically boils down to, what are you happy to happen with your source code? My choice is GPL, because it means that nobody can take my code and hide it away. You could have a different decision, and that's perfectly reasonable and valid. Open source has been so successful as a philosophy for software that other groups are actually starting to use it now, and this is really interesting stuff. So we've got groups like OpenStreetMap, who are about open maps, GovHack, using government data that our taxes have already paid for and making products out of it. OSOS is a New Zealand conference called Open Source Open Societies, and that's about pushing the open source principles into other communities. So governance, financial industry, business, training. That is an open source conference that has no open source software people in it. It's all people in other fields. Open science is a big movement at the moment. Rather than having to spend money to put your research stuff into journals and then pay again to get it out, put it into an open journal like the Public Library of Science. Open Australia, they run Your Right to Know. They work for you, so you basically get to track the decisions that your politicians are making, and planning alerts. So you give them your address, and anytime there's a building planning application within N kilometres of your home, you get an email about it. All of this means that open source is not just restricted to software. It's a much bigger field that you can play in. Having said all of these positive things, it's incumbent on me to highlight some of the issues that open source communities have. If you're a white, straight guy, they're great. The further you get away from that, the more issues you'll have. We are definitely trying to improve that, but we still have a fair way to go. That's my last slide. So probably have gone over time, I imagine.
Unfortunately, we have. Thank you very much, and we'll give him a round of applause.